Hi, I'm Carl Grodach. I'm Professor of Urban Planning and Design at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. First, thanks for inviting me to speak at the Productive Processes seminar. I wish I could be there in person and have a more robust discussion, but nonetheless, I hope you find this talk useful. I'm going to talk about some of the challenges and opportunities in industrial land use planning based on research that I've conducted over the last 5 years in Australia and the United States. And to begin, setting the scene, I think many of you are very familiar that we've been through a period of major restructuring in our cities around high and low skilled service work. And I would argue that this transition has come about in part, at least, through the rezoning of industrial land to support this economy and to fuel property redevelopment. And as this process has unfolded, as cities have gentrified, we've also seen a slow recognition in urban policy circles that cities actually need industrial land, even in a post-industrial economy, that manufacture still matters. And I think this slow movement has been quite positive, but I would argue that policy frameworks continue to be outmoded and give us a limited set of understanding of industrial lands, and this has led to often inappropriate and ineffective land use policy to support industrial activity. And I think, of course, there's trade-offs that we have to anticipate given cost-competitive real estate markets in many cities in Europe, in North America, and Australia. But at the same time, rethinking our policy frameworks and approach to planning for industrial land can help engender a more productive city through that planning process. The productive city is a concept that I think is much more common in Europe. It hasn't really emerged to much of an extent in Australia and the US. But nonetheless, I think we're all dealing with similar ideas. Basically, as I understand the productive city, it challenges us to think of the city as more than a site of consumption for the creative class and sets up a counter narrative to thinking about urban economies as predominantly run on high wage knowledge economy work. It also argues that service economies are nonetheless dependent on a myriad of industrial activities and skills. And so an aim of the productive city idea is to reintegrate manufacturing industrial activity into the city. And so by definition, a productive city requires a variety and diversity in industrial land if we're going to support a functional and resilient economy. But there are challenges that are extant. Our policy frameworks or imaginaries, I think, continue to be outdated. This results in a misguided approach to planning industrial land, particularly in relationship to very cost-competitive real estate markets. Planning has really largely failed to recognize the contributions of industrial zoned land to a resilient economy, and the fact that they offer an often under-recognized source of quality employment, support a diverse industry and occupational mix while underpinning essential and local serving industries. So we conducted a recent study looking at all employment areas in Greater Melbourne under the strategic plan, Plan Melbourne. And one of the things that was really striking was that industrial zones, while they, of course, have a lower employment density compared to other employment areas, they actually support the largest share of employment overall. In fact, just over a quarter of the Melbourne workforce goes to work to an industrial zone every day. And this is even a larger share than the central business district or central city. Industrial zones also support a really wide variety of employment in different industries, not just manufacturing and industrial services, but also construction, knowledge creative industries, and even population serving industries. This is in contrast to the other employment areas like the central city, which is primarily around knowledge, creative industries work, which includes finance, insurance, real estate sectors, and the other employment areas, which are more about local serving, retail, food service, and so forth. Industrial zones support a fairly even mix of high, middle, and low skill employment, in contrast to the central city, which loads primarily high on managerial and professional work, or in the lower middle bracket for clerical and sales employment. And then finally, looking at income as a measure of quality employment, industrial zones provide employment opportunities across the income spectrum, particularly in middle income jobs. Again, in contrast to the central city, which is predominantly in high wage professional services work. And one of the problems here is that in Australia, most of our planning attention goes to the central city. This is seen as by far the most dominant area of employment. And yet when we're planning for this, we're clearly planning for upwardly mobile professional services employment rather than the diversity of activity that industrial zones accommodate. And part of this stems from the fact that planning policy continues to misunderstand the value of industrial zones lands. In a recent article, we say that planning policy is caught between entrenched visions of deindustrialization and a renewed advanced manufacturing sector that's firmly embedded in the knowledge economy. Some of this has changed after COVID. There's recognition of new onshoring opportunities, but largely planning continues to conceptualize industrial land as being predominantly for large footprint, low employment density uses that have potential land use conflicts with other activities. And so industrial zone land in this mindset is really for large warehouse and logistic operations that want to be in the outer suburbs where they can get cheap land and proximity to transportation networks. The impact of this on the ground over the last 20 years is that Melbourne has lost a sizable share of inner and middle suburban industrial zone land as it's been rezoned for residential and mixed use development. This mixed use development is in fact largely residential mid-rise with ground floor retail cafe activity. At the same time this has occurred, we've added quite a bit of industrial land in the outer suburbs, and in fact we've had a net additional industrial land over the last 20 years just as we're rezoning and losing this central city industrial land. We've also seen a rising rebranding of manufacturing, particularly around kind of tech and innovation-driven advanced manufacturing that's aligned with a knowledge economy. And so as a result, there's not really a need for inner city industrial land, even if this advanced manufacturing activity is linked up to a knowledge economy. Rather, industrial zone land should be rezoned for mixed-use innovation districts so that all of this new economic activity can interact in an environment that's supportive. The problem is that mixed-use development, well, it tends to support more walkable, transit-oriented places. Studies show that it also is associated with declining affordability as it displaces existing residents and businesses in an area. It also reduces the land use and employment mix because you're primarily building residential and office space for a professional services economy, in contrast to that diverse mix of industry and occupations that we see in industrial land. And then in addition to this, this policy direction has a blind spot around other forms of manufacturing that don't fit neatly within the advanced manufacturing focus. And one of the things that we've discovered in Australia is that the vast majority of manufacturing activity is quite small scale. 90% of firms employ fewer than 20 people. 75% employ less than 5 people. And so a lot of this work, because it's small, it's highly specialized, but it's not necessarily dependent on high levels of research and development and advanced production techniques. A lot of it is very hands-on and associated with craft and cultural industries. And a lot of it is quite highly networked with local industries and amongst other manufacturing firms. And as a result, is quite dependent on industrial zoned land right at a time when we are rezoning and removing this from the land use. So from a land use perspective, how do we support the spectrum of urban industry that defines the productive city in the context of a very strong real estate market and the legacy of industrial rezoning? I think the most common explanation or recommendation is for industrial preservation zones, and this is certainly what my colleagues in the US call for. Industrial preservation zones are important because they restrict competing and conflicting uses. They keep out residential and office development that would otherwise lead to increased rents, as well as complaints from occupants around noise and odor and truck traffic and so forth. And these areas are typically established industrial zones, so alongside being comparatively more affordable, they also offer a range of flexible space that allows firms to grow and expand, and in turn support the agglomeration of specialized manufacturing activities or the localization economies that can develop in place. The problem is that even in cities with industrial preservation policies, they're most frequently an idea more than reality, in that through a history of challenges around enforcing non-compliant uses or developers taking advantage of loopholes in the code language, we've seen live-work spaces, various types of office development, and even residential development go into industrial preservation zones and other industrial zones as well. Furthermore, a recent study in New York shows that these type of areas with really strong protection tend to slow industrial decline, but they don't necessarily support the growth of new industry activity. And so even very established zones that we're familiar with, cases like Portland's industrial sanctuaries or planned manufacturing districts in Chicago or in San Francisco, these zones have a difficulty really retaining industrial land, or I should say planners have difficulty doing this, and they're starting to rethink them around more mixed use opportunities or carving out some of the preservation zones for this type of activity. And so these are starting to crumble in some sense, as important as they are. And part of the reason for this is a lot of people see industrial zones as having very rigid, outdated code language that doesn't support a lot of the industry that will actually continue to exist in urban centers, and these types of businesses, whether it's food and beverage or a ceramics manufacturer, they tend to locate in shared spaces. Because they have smaller setups, they tend to combine production and retail functions, so they need higher retail ratios in place that industrial zones typically don't support. And so because of this, and I think this is really where a lot of the push from productive city advocates come from, we have seen a rise in calls for mixed use industrial areas or mixed use industry districts that will enable the reintegration of manufacturing and some industry within the urban context. And in a way, this makes sense, because if the existing manufacturing and industrial activity in cities is predominantly small and multifunctional and highly networked, then it makes sense that they might require more of a mixed-use space, and eschew the high regulatory environment of industrial zone, and they don't need to worry so much about the separation of noxious uses. What they really need is smaller floor plate mixed buildings, again, higher retail ratios so that they can sell their products on site, and access to amenities as well. And we've slowly seen this kind of approach come out, one in a sort of kind of inadvertent way around commercial zones that allow light industry, allow that mix of certain types of low impact manufacturing in particular. And another more novel approach is through the introduction of non-industrial uses into industrial zones through so-called cross-subsidy or hybrid planning mechanisms. So an example of this would be the production, distribution, and repair, or PDR industrial zones in San Francisco. They were amended a few years back to allow new projects that would support new production space. And basically what the amendment said in very brief terms is that an office development can go into an industrial zone on underutilized land if 1/3 of the new project is for productive activity, industrial manufacturing activity. And the idea is that the comparably lower rents in industrial zones will attract office development, which will then use that savings to subsidize the new manufacturing space. And SF Made and the city of San Francisco piloted a project, 150 Hooper Street, that did this, that brought the first new manufacturing space into San Francisco in decades, and really supports a broad range of manufacturing activity, from boutique whiskey distillery to cut and sew operations. And while this is, I think, a successful case, at the same time, it still depends on that high cost market, those real estate dynamics that lead to industrial gentrification in order to realize its success. So it's quite possible that down the road rents are going to rise because of projects like this, and it will ultimately displace some manufacturing uses in the area. And I think overall advocates around mixed use industry development they really tend to overlook the real estate property market pressures that are at play, and kind of assume that the manufacturing that will go in is that which can afford it. And if that's the case, then we're likely, in most cases, going to see more boutique maker manufacturing enterprises only, and we're not really supporting that industry and employment mix and really growth in these sectors that the productive city calls for. The third sort of model is something that we've been starting to look at through other work, speaking to food and beverage manufacturers in Melbourne. And it's a sort of de facto mixed-use industrial preservation zone. So really it has been the result of some of the problems with zoning for industrial uses in central Melbourne. As I mentioned before, we've seen a lot of rezoning to commercial and mixed-use development as well as residential. And in the process, what's been left behind are a kind of patchwork of pocket industrial zones. And the interesting thing about them is that first, they are adjacent to these rezoned areas, residential, mixed use. So there's a built-in market for small manufacturers, particularly those that want to sell their products on site, but also because a history of kind of weak enforcement and other conditional use permits, the zones themselves often have a mix of activity. But at the same time, they still come with the teeth of an industrial zone. So businesses don't face complaints from residents or others in the area or they do face complaints, but they don't have to comply with them necessarily because the zoning code supports industrial business there. And the rents in these areas are tend to be quite a bit less than some of the adjacent mixed-use areas. Some of the problems, however, that manufacturers run into here is particularly when they want to adapt a site for their business. And again, this is particularly the case for those that want to sell their products on site. Getting conditional use permits can be a very onerous and expensive process to put in a cafe or restaurant or something else on the side. And again, this is dealing with food and beverage primarily. And the other thing that comes up with newer activity that's going in, like say a whiskey distillery, is sometimes off the planner's radar. They don't really understand how the businesses work, and this creates further problems as well. So to sum up, these are three current models of industrial zoning that may support urban industry, but of course they all come with trade-offs. I still think they can be a blueprint for experimenting with new models under supportive policy environments. The problem that we're working with in Australia is, again, the mindset tends to be a few years behind where it should be. The policy frameworks, the strategic plans for industrial land aren't necessarily in place to support the kind of changes we'd like to see. And yet, despite this, like in Melbourne, we see potential opportunities appearing under the radar of official, planning agendas for out of suburban industrial land. So we have to accept that there's inherent trade-offs with any zoning decision. There are major challenges around urban industrial land in cities in terms of the urban restructuring that we've seen over the last few decades. And although there's no perfect solution, we still have opportunities to address some of these problems in terms of tight real estate markets and competing agendas for bringing housing into the central city, and the way we think about knowledge economies in urban areas as well. And I think productive city agendas really need to take account of this and think through how they're going to address these competing agendas in order to move industrial land use and zoning forward into the future.